Well, hello. In this video, we're going to talk about the case that is going on at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. And I'm standing here before the old city of Jerusalem, known by many people as East Jerusalem. In many ways, this case before the International Court of Justice, the ICJ as it's known, has got a lot to do with the city of Jerusalem. And my intention in this video is to try and unpack the case and give you a sense of what is really happening in the advisory opinion proceedings. In December 2022, 87 UN member states adopted a resolution in the UN General Assembly in New York, a resolution asking the court in The Hague to give an advisory opinion on three legal questions. First of all, what are the legal consequences arising? And I'm reading this out because it's important to hear the exact words that the General Assembly asked. The legal consequences arising from the ongoing violation by Israel of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. So that's the first question. Secondly, the consequences arising from its prolonged occupation, settlement and annexation of the Palestinian territory, occupied since 1967. That's the second. And then the status of the Holy City of Jerusalem and the adoption of related discriminatory legislation and measures. This is the question the court is being asked to answer. And at this very moment, we're speaking at the beginning of July, we are expecting a decision by the court any day in answer to these questions. Last year, 2023, the court heard submissions from 53 states and 3 international organizations. It's important to know which ones they were: the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC, the Arab League, the League of Arab States, and thirdly, the African Union. They also were represented in the court and made extensive submissions to the court. And a number of smaller states and other states were also arguing in favor of the Palestinian case. Now, let's just go back before I talk more about this to 1929, almost 100 years ago. After the First World War, the Ottoman Turkish Empire had collapsed, it had fallen, it was defeated by the Allied powers in the First World War. And the Middle East and many parts of Africa and other parts of the world had to be, as it were, reorganized. They had to be given a new status because they were no longer part of this empire which ceased to exist. The Turkish state of Turkey, which came into existence, relinquished any claims over the territories outside the current borders of Turkey. And so the Allied powers had to make a decision as to the future of the territories. And they introduced a system of mandates to enable the peoples of the regions to achieve self-determination, independence, autonomy. This was the beginning of self-determination. One of the peoples, obviously, in the Middle East was the Jewish people. And they decided that in Palestine, there would be a reconstitution of the Jewish homeland in Palestine. This was very contentious, of course, but it was a decision by the Allied powers. It was ratified by the League of Nations in the mandate for Palestine. Now, in 1929, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who'd been appointed by the British to lead the Arab Palestinians, rejected any idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine and incited the Palestinians to violence. And one of the first was the attack and massacre in Hebron of over 70 Jews. The British were slow in responding, and this was the first of many pogroms and massacres in Palestine incited by al-Husseini, who was the Islamist leader of the Palestinians at the time. So I say that because really we saw two things happen that we have seen time and again over the past 100 years. First, the rejection of even the idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, that the Jewish people should have some kind of autonomy, self-determination. And secondly, the resort to violence as a response. And I believe we see that today in the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, using those two instruments, as it were, in response to the Jewish homeland, now the State of Israel. It's relevant because this is the context in which the case that is going on in The Hague is proceeding. Now, this questions or series of questions that are being put to the court, in my view, are nothing less than an assault on the sovereignty, even the existence of the Jewish state of Israel. On the 7th of October last year, we had an invasion from the Gaza Strip into Israel. Over 3,000 terrorists determined to slaughter and massacre as many Israelis as they could find. This was an invasion, not just a terrorist attack. That invasion, I think we see reflected in the cases that are proceeding before the court. This is a kind of assault on the existence and the sovereignty of the State of Israel. That's not an overstatement, and I wish to explain why we think that is the case. I have 7 points I want to share with you, which all reflect this idea that we are seeing a fundamental, this is not a request for a legal opinion on legal issues. This is an attempt to, as it were, annihilate the legitimacy of the Jewish state. It begins with the rewriting of history. In the case, the questions themselves that are put to the court assume, as we've heard, that this territory is Palestinian, that Israel is violating Palestinian rights, and that Israel is an apartheid regime. Now, the case was launched by the Palestinians who really have been leading this whole campaign. I'll come back to that in a moment. The case that they put is a fundamental one, which basically says that all of Palestine, and we're meaning here what is currently the State of Israel, all of the occupied, administered territories west of the Jordan River, all of Palestine from the river to the sea belongs to the Palestinians. Everything that has happened, according to the Palestinian claims in the court, since 1918, since the end of the First World War, since the creation of a Jewish homeland, has been an illegitimate and a fundamental violation of Palestinian rights because they are the sole indigenous owners of the land. They claim, and they're looking for the court to support their claim to full sovereignty over all of Palestine. In their historical narrative, there is no place for the Jewish people. They present the history of Palestine going right back to the Canaanites as if the Jewish people never existed, as if there was never any Jewish presence in the land. This belonged always to the Palestinian people, who are defined by definition as Arab Palestinians. This means that the Jewish state of Israel is illegitimate, which leads them to the apartheid claim. They position the Jewish state as a racist entity that is imposing a racist regime on non-Jews, both within Israel and in the so-called occupied territories. So it's a rewriting of history, or at least a very extreme narrative that is being presented. The second point is about Palestinian rejectionism. There's nothing that's being presented to the court And I'll come back to the process in a moment, because the process in itself is highly problematic. There's nothing in the materials, the information that is given to the court to give any sense that over the last 100 years, the Palestinian leadership has consistently rejected proposals for division of the land, two-state proposals or other proposals for the division of the land. Ever since 1920, al-Husseini was an example of this, that instead of accepting compromise as a solution to the conflict, they present an extreme zero-sum claim to all of Palestine belonging to the Arab Palestinians. We don't have time to go into the details, but we know that the Palestinian Liberation Organization today, which is really the driving force behind these claims, it's Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of Fatah, which is the main group within the PLO. The PLO still exists. The PLO is governed by a charter, the Palestine National Charter, and that charter has never been amended since 1968. You might remember Yasser Arafat promising to Bill Clinton in 1993, when the Oslo Accords were signed, he said, "We will change the charter to remove all the clauses which deny the legitimacy of the State of Israel." That has never happened. The charter is still intact as it was in 1968, and that includes the call to violence and jihad to destroy the Zionist entity being the State of Israel. The claim to all of Palestine as belonging to the Palestinians. That claim has never changed, and it's represented in what the Palestinians have put to the court over the last few weeks and months. Thirdly, I'd like to speak about the manipulation of this court and other courts for political purposes. This case, the advisory opinion proceedings before the ICJ, are part of other cases going on, and one of them, apart from the genocide cases before the ICJ, one brought by South Africa against Israel, another by Nicaragua against Germany, all about Israel's violation of the Genocide Convention. We also have the Palestinians and the Palestinian delegation manipulating the International Criminal Court. And very similar issue there is under discussion, and that is, well, to whom does this territory belong? And the claims put by the Palestinians to the ICC, the criminal court, are very similar. They're the same, obviously, because it's the same entity that is putting the claim to the ICJ, and that is that all of Palestine belongs to the Palestinians. They've made no secret of their strategy of using the courts as a tool, as a weapon, as a forum for advancing their political and ideological goals. Mahmoud Abbas published an op-ed, a very famous one, in the New York Times in 2011, announcing that the Palestinians have put aside the Oslo process. They see no future in negotiations. They're going to the UN, to the courts, to advance their claims for statehood. And that is exactly what they have done. The first step was the 2012 resolution adopted by a number of UN member states, granting the Palestinians UN non-member observer state status. Resolution 6719. That resolution has given them the platform to accede to many multilateral treaties, including the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. They now present themselves as the state of Palestine, as they are doing in the International Court of Justice. It's the state of Palestine which is presenting its case. I'd like to speak a little bit about the proceedings themselves. I've said that the whole thing was initiated by the General Assembly resolution, December 2022. We had 50, this was adopted, by the way, by only 87 member states. That's significantly less than half of the number of UN member states. So we're talking about an initiative which is supported by less than half of the UN member states. How does that happen? That happens because many states abstain from voting, or they simply are not present when the voting takes place. So the majority of UN member states are not supporting openly these proceedings before the court, and yet it is presented as if this is an overwhelming majority of the UN member states. It is not. Secondly, the number of states that participate in the proceedings before the court, so they come, they bring a delegation to the court, they put their case in writing and orally to the court. Those 53 member states and the 3 international organizations represent overwhelmingly the anti-Western states in the UN General Assembly. So we have a proceeding here which is driven ideologically by states who have a fundamentally anti-Israel, anti-Western agenda. We saw it in the questions as they're formulated to the court. They asked the court to assume legal and historical facts, which they don't prove, but they simply asked the court to assume them. Firstly, that it's Palestinian territory. Secondly, that Israel is violating Palestinian rights to self-determination. And thirdly, that there is an illegal occupation. I'll come back to those. This is in fact a contentious case which is being run under the guise of an advisory opinion. The ICJ has 2 functions. It can hear contentious cases and it can give opinions, advisory opinions to UN organs. It can only hear contentious cases, that is a case that is a dispute between 2 states, if there is agreement by the states, this principle of consensus, the sovereignty of states. Israel has not consented to these proceedings, and yet the court is about probably to issue a ruling, an opinion, non-binding, but nevertheless a very persuasive and authoritative opinion about Israel's legal rights and obligations. That is a decision which concerns the rights and obligations of a UN member state which has not consented to the proceedings. Now, another very, very problematic aspect of this case is the question of evidence. A whole raft of information is presented to the court through UN reports and UN resolutions. Over 29,000 pages of documents have been given to the court purporting to be evidence of all the historical and other facts that the Palestinians are bringing about violations of their human rights, violations of their self-determination rights, of their historical and legal claims to sovereignty over the territory. It's all about UN documents and UN resolutions. This court, being a court of law, has a responsibility to act judicially. That means it has a responsibility to test and verify every piece of information that is brought to it. And yet there's no way the court is going to be able to go through 29,000 pages of documents and independently verify their veracity. That is simply beyond the capacity of the court. So inevitably, it's going to be persuaded by these voluminous resolutions of the General Assembly which state issues of fact without providing all the evidence that's needed to support them. Finally, there is a problem about judicial independence. Unfortunately, we need to raise this issue. Every member of this court has a responsibility to perform his or her duties and exercise his or her powers as a judge honourably, faithfully, impartially, and conscientiously. That is the role of a judge. And yet we do see on this court a number of judges who have taken positions on the issues that are the subject of these proceedings prior to being on the court. And I can mention the president of the court, who was the ambassador and permanent representative of Lebanon to the United Nations for 10 years and has expressed opinions about Israel's lack of rights in relation to these territories. This is problematic because we have judges who have already taken a position on matters that are in dispute. I'd like to turn now to the questions of international law that are the subject of these proceedings. And there are 5 in particular. First of all, Israel's sovereignty. This whole matter revolves around the existence of the State of Israel, which was created in 1948. Let's not forget, in 1947, November the 29th, the UN General Assembly adopted a partition plan to divide Palestine into an Arab and a Jewish state, with Jerusalem to become an international city. That whole idea, which would have created a peaceful resolution of the conflict, was rejected by the Arabs, and including the Arab Palestinians. This was the beginning of the war, which led ultimately, in the midst of the war in 1948, at the end of the mandate, to the creation of the State of Israel. The Palestinians could have had their own state. At that time they chose not to, but Israel was brought into existence. The Declaration of Independence of Israel proclaims the creation of the Jewish state of Israel for all the inhabitants of Israel in the territory of Eretz Israel, that is, the territory of Israel. The borders were undefined. They were not expressed in the Declaration of Independence. But the net result of the Arab rejection of the establishment of the State of Israel was the War of Independence, the invasion by Jordan, Egypt, and other Arab states to illegally take territory. Jordan occupied for 19 years the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip. This was illegal in the sense that their use of force in 1948, 1949 was illegal, clearly a breach of the UN Charter. So the question revolves around Israel's sovereignty. Now, that whole issue is not being put to this court. The court is not being asked, nor is it being given evidence about the scope of Israel's sovereignty. How can you determine the Palestinian rights to sovereignty and statehood if you don't already have a clear understanding of the scope of Israel's sovereignty? No, the Palestinians sweep all of that aside and they say, no, we Palestinians have the sole rights to sovereignty and statehood in all of the territory. They do claim statehood on the pre-1967 lines, that is the green line, but the basis of their claim, the fundamental thrust of their claim, is all of Palestine. The second problem is about occupation and self-defense. They claim that the occupation since 1967 has become illegal and probably was even illegal from the very beginning. They say that Israel has no right of self-defense. It no longer has a justification for control or administration of the West Bank, even East Jerusalem or Gaza. Israel must totally, immediately, and unconditionally withdraw military and civilians from these territories. That is the Palestinian claim. This is highly problematic. There are 2 reasons why Israel has strong claims to its presence. It has a strong claim to sovereignty because of the mandate for Palestine, the history of the territories legally after the First World War. That is the reason that Israel has a right to claim and assert sovereignty over the whole city of Jerusalem. Secondly, it has the right to secure borders. It has the right to protect its citizens from terror and from threats and actual attacks from these territories, the right to self-defense. And this is what the Palestinians here are attacking. They're saying, no, Israel has no right to be in the territories. There is no need for Israel to be preventing attacks and threats of attacks from the territories. Thirdly, about Palestinian sovereignty and self-determination, they claim a right to statehood. They say the right to self-determination includes the right to establish a state. This is, again, an extreme presentation of the law. The law of self-determination does not give people groups an automatic or absolute right to statehood, and no self-determination of any people group can be realized or achieved without agreement and consensus with the surrounding sovereign states. No self-determination right can be allowed to infringe the territorial integrity or political independence of sovereign states. That's a fundamental principle of international law. Nor does self-determination give a right to use violence. They present their case, and supported by many other states, as being a people that is subject to a foreign occupation by a colonialist, racist entity, the State of Israel. They have a right to use force and violence to free themselves from this colonialism. This is a false narrative. Israel is not a colonialist entity. It is in fact itself the result of decolonization. It is the result of self-determination. And Israel and the Palestinians have to reach an agreement in order to enable the Palestinians to achieve full autonomy and independence. There is no way for the Palestinians beyond an agreed solution. The danger is that this court will reach conclusions, legal conclusions, which undermine the obligation of the Palestinians to negotiate in good faith. This brings me to the Oslo Accords. These are the agreements between Israel and the PLO in the 1990s to establish a process for a final agreement on all the many, many complex issues that are involved in two people groups living side by side in a very small and complex territory. The only way to resolve these complex issues is through negotiations and agreement. These Oslo Accords are simply swept aside by the Palestinians. They say they're no longer relevant. They have an absolute right under international law which overrides existing agreements. This is, again, problematic. Finally, I just point about East Jerusalem, which is presented as if it was some kind of illegal settlement. Let's not forget that East Jerusalem, we mean here the old city of Jerusalem, where Jews have been living for thousands of years. This has been a Jewish majority city for many, many decades and centuries. In the middle of the 19th century, even before Zionism really took off, Jerusalem was a majority Jewish city. The Arabs and the Islamic world had little interest in Jerusalem. Only when the Jews started to return did the Arabs decide that this has become a central point of their global strategy. The OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, made a central point of their claims in the court, the liberation of Jerusalem from Israel. So the idea that this is a kind of illegal settlement, a colonial enterprise, is again a rewriting of history and law. My next point is about the problems of Palestinian statehood. This case is all about Palestinian statehood. The claims put to the court are intended to give legitimacy to the claim that the Palestinians have a right to sovereignty and full statehood, avoiding negotiations and agreement with Israel. Two problems, I think, here. First of all, what is this state of Palestine that is being created? Are we setting ourselves up for another failed Islamist state in the Middle East? Who is going to govern this state? There is no governing authority in Gaza and the West Bank which is capable of governing the peoples of this territory. The Palestinian Authority is corrupt and inadequate. Everybody knows it. The Hamas has taken control of the Gaza Strip. The West Bank is being taken over by Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It's all being financed by Iran and Qatar and other states with an extreme Islamist agenda. So what kind of state of Palestine are we creating here? And secondly, what are the borders of this state? I said earlier, the claims of the Palestinians are not just to the pre-67 lines, it is to all of Palestine. Is this state of Palestine being created in order to be able to launch a campaign to further delegitimize and destroy the Jewish state of Israel, even within the pre-67 lines as they are known? This is a very important point. Finally, to speak briefly about negotiations and security. The creation of a Palestinian state, the obligation on Israel to withdraw from these territories has huge security implications, not only for Israel, but for other states in the region and perhaps even globally. The West Bank, as it's known to the Jewish people, known as Judea and Samaria, is the mountain area of Palestine. That's why Jerusalem is so important. Jerusalem is part of this mountain area, and those who control the mountains will control all of Palestine. Israel has always known from the very beginning that control of the area is essential. That's why the position under even the Oslo Accords has been that they will have to negotiate some kind of arrangement whereby Israel has a presence and is able to secure the Jordan Valley and the West Bank. Even Rabin, who signed the Oslo Accords, was very strong on this point. There will be no absolute military-powered Palestinian state without strong Israeli security measures in place. So the West Bank is absolutely central, and East Jerusalem is the most central in all of this. So what is being asked here of the court is a ruling that Israel must withdraw every Jew, every soldier from the old city of Jerusalem, from the surrounding areas of Judea and Samaria. This would be suicide for Israel. Israel will, of course, never do this. So a ruling along these lines is setting up a context for further violence and insecurity in the region. Just take Gaza as an example. Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, and the result was Hamas, and the result was the 7th of October last year. Is this what the world is asking Israel to do, to withdraw and set itself up for another invasion by Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other Iranian-sponsored terrorist regimes? Is this what the court will ask Israel to do? Our concern that a ruling along the lines demanded by the Palestinian delegation and other states is setting this whole thing up for further violence in the region and further anti-Semitism globally. We're going to see a revival and a further growth of the BDS movement, pushing for boycotts, divestment, sanctions against Israel, the further delegitimization of the State of Israel. This conflict will never be resolved without compromise by both sides, and yet the claims being put to the court are extreme and they avoid the possibility of compromise. We believe the only way forward is through genuine bottom-up negotiations and agreement, and then Jews and Arabs, Christians, Muslims and others will all live in the land together in cooperation, not through one-sided judicial measures imposing one-sided solutions. Thank you so much, and we will continue to watch this space as things develop over the next few weeks. Thank you so much.